my country, right or left. Contrary to popular belief, the past was not more eventful than the present. If it seems so, it is because, when you look backward, things that happened years apart are telescoped together, and because very few of your memories come to you genuinely virgin. It is largely because of the books, films, and reminiscences that have come between that the war of 1914 through 18 is now supposed to have had some tremendous, epic quality that the present one lacks. But if you were alive during that war, and if you disentangle your real memories from their later accretions, you find that it was not usually the big events that stirred you at the time. I don't believe that the Battle of the Marne, for instance, had, for the general public, the melodramatic quality that it was afterwards given. I do not even remember hearing the phrase Battle of the Marne till years later. It was merely that the Germans were 22 miles from Paris, and certainly that was terrifying enough after the Belgian atrocity stories, and then, for some reason, they had turned back. I was 11 when the war started. If I honestly sort out my memories and disregard what I have learned since, I must admit that nothing in the whole war moved me so deeply as the loss of the Titanic had done a few years earlier. This comparatively petty disaster shocked the whole world, and the shock has not quite died away even yet. I remember the terrible, detailed accounts read out at the breakfast table. In those days, it was a common habit to read the newspaper aloud. And I remember that in all the long list of horrors, the one that most impressed me was that, at the last, the Titanic suddenly upended and sank bow foremost, so that the people clinging to the stern were lifted no less than 300 feet into the air before they plunged into the abyss. It gave me a sinking sensation in the belly, which I can still all but feel. Nothing in the war ever gave me quite that sensation. Of the outbreak of war, I have 3 vivid memories, which, being petty and irrelevant, are uninfluenced by anything that has come later. One is the cartoon of the German Emperor. I believe the hated name Kaiser was not popularized till a little later, that appeared in the last days of July. People were mildly shocked by this guying of royalty. But he's such a handsome man, really. Although we were on the edge of war. Another is of the time when the army commandeered all the horses in our little country town, and a cabman burst into tears in the marketplace when his horse, which had worked for him for years, was taken away from him. And another is of a mob of young men at the railway station, scrambling for the evening papers that had just arrived on the London train. And I remember the pile of pea-green papers. Some of them were still green in those days. The high collars, the tightish trousers, and the bowler hats. Far better than I can remember the names of the terrific battles that were already raging on the French frontier. Of the middle years of the war, I remember chiefly the square shoulders, bulging calves, and jingling spurs of the artillerymen, whose uniform I much preferred to that of the infantry. And as for the final period, if you ask me to say truthfully what is my chief memory, I must answer simply, margarine. It is an instance of the horrible selfishness of children that by 1917 the war had almost ceased to affect us, except through our stomachs. In the school library, a huge map of the Western Front was pinned on an easel, with a red silk thread running across on a zigzag of drawing pins. Occasionally, the thread moved half an inch this way or that, each movement meaning a pyramid of corpses. I paid no attention. I was at school among boys who were above the average level of intelligence, and yet I do not remember that a single major event of the time appeared to us in its true significance. The Russian Revolution, for instance, made no major impression, except on the few whose parents happened to have money invested in Russia. Among the very young, the pacifist reaction had set in long before the world ended. To be as slack as you dared on OTC parades, and to take no interest in the war, was considered a mark of enlightenment. The young officers who had come back, hardened by their terrible experience and disgusted by the attitude of the younger generation to whom this experience meant just nothing, used to lecture us for our softness. Of course, they could produce no argument that we were capable of understanding. They could only bark at you that war was a good thing. It made you tough, kept you fit, etc., etc. We merely sniggered at them. Ours was the one-eyed pacifism that is peculiar to sheltered countries with strong navies. For years after the war, to have knowledge of or interest in military matters, even to know which end of a gun the bullet comes out of, was suspect in enlightened circles. 1914 through 18 was written off as a meaningless slaughter, and even the men who had been slaughtered were held to be in some way to blame. I have often laughed to think of that recruiting poster. What did you do in the Great War, Daddy? A child is asking this question of its shame-stricken father. And of all the men who must have been lured into the army by just that poster and afterwards despised by their children for not being conscientious objectors. But the dead men had their revenge after all. As the war fell back into the past, my particular generation, those who had been just too young, became conscious of the vastness of the experience they had missed. You felt yourself a little less than a man because you had missed it. I spent the years 1922 through 7 mostly among men a little older than myself who had been through the war. They talked about it unceasingly, with horror, of course, but also with a steadily growing nostalgia. You can see this nostalgia perfectly clearly in the English war books. Besides, the pacifist reaction was only a phase, and even the just too young had all been trained for war. Most of the English middle class are trained for war from the cradle onwards, not technically, but morally. The earliest political slogan I can remember is, "We want 8 dreadnoughts, and we won't wait." At 7 years old, I was a member of the Navy League and wore a sailor suit with HMS Invincible on my cap. Even before my public school OTC, I had been in a private school cadet corps. On and off, I have been toting a rifle ever since I was 10, in preparation not only for war, but for a particular kind of war, a war in which the guns rise to a frantic orgasm of sound, and, at the appointed moment, you clamber out of the trench, breaking your nails on the sandbags, and stumble across mud and wire into the machine gun barrage. I am convinced that part of the reason for the fascination that the Spanish Civil War had for people of about my age was that it was so like the Great War. At certain moments, Franco was able to scrape together enough aeroplanes to raise the war to a modern level, and these were the turning points. But for the rest, it was a bad copy of 1914 through 18, a positional war of trenches, artillery, raids, snipers, mud, barbed wire, lice, and stagnation. In early 1937, the bit of the Aragon front that I was on must have been very like a quiet sector of France in 1915. It was only the artillery that was lacking. Even on the rare occasions when all the guns in Hunesca and outside it were firing simultaneously, there were only enough of them to make a fitful, unimpressive noise, like the ending of a thunderstorm. The shells from Franco's 6-inch guns crashed loudly enough, but there were never more than a dozen of them at a time. I know that what I felt when I first heard artillery fired in anger, as they say, was at least partly disappointment. It was so different from the tremendous, unbroken roar that my senses had been waiting for 20 years. I don't quite know in what year I first knew for certain that the present war was coming. After 1936, of course, the thing was obvious to anyone except an idiot. For several years, the coming war was a nightmare to me, and at times I even made speeches and wrote pamphlets against it. But the night before the Russo-German Pact was announced, I dreamed that the war had started. It was one of those dreams which, whatever Freudian inner meaning they may have, do sometimes reveal to you the real state of your feelings. It taught me two things. First, that I should be simply relieved when the long-dreaded war started. Secondly, that I was patriotic at heart, would not sabotage or act against my own side, would support the war, would fight in it if possible. I came downstairs to find the newspaper announcing Ribbentrop's flight to Moscow. So war was coming, and the government, even the Chamberlain government, was assured of my loyalty. Needless to say, this loyalty was and remains merely a gesture. As with almost everyone I know, the government has flatly refused to employ me in any capacity whatever, even as a clerk or a private soldier. But that does not alter one's feelings. Besides, they will be forced to make use of us sooner or later. If I had to defend my reasons for supporting the war, I believe I could do so. There is no real alternative between resisting Hitler and surrendering to him, and from a socialist point of view, I should say that it is better to resist. In any case, I can see no argument for surrender that does not make nonsense of the Republican resistance in Spain, the Chinese resistance to Japan, etc., etc. But I don't pretend that that is the emotional basis of my actions. What I knew in my dream that night was that the long drilling in patriotism which the middle classes go through had done its work, and that once England was in a serious jam, it would be impossible for me to sabotage. But let no one mistake the meaning of this. Patriotism has nothing to do with conservatism. It is devotion to something that is changing, but is felt to be, mystically, the same, like the devotion of the ex-white Bolshevik to Russia. To be loyal both to Chamberlain's England and to the England of tomorrow might seem an impossibility, if one did not know it to be an everyday phenomenon. Only revolution can save England. That has been obvious for years. But now the revolution has started, and it may proceed quite quickly if only we can keep Hitler out. Within 2 years, maybe a year, if only we can hang on, we shall see changes that will surprise the idiots who have no foresight. I dare say the London gutters will have to run with blood. All right, let them, if it is necessary. But when the Red Militias are billeted in the Ritz, I shall still feel that the England I was taught to love so long ago, and for such differing reasons, is somehow persisting. I grew up in an atmosphere tinged with militarism, and afterwards I spent 5 boring years within the sound of bugles. To this day, it gave me a faint feeling of sacrilege not to stand to attention during God Save the King. That is childish, of course, but I would sooner have had that kind of upbringing than be like the left-wing intellectuals who are so enlightened that they cannot understand the most ordinary emotions. It is exactly the people whose hearts have never leapt at the sight of a Union Jack who will flinch from revolution when the moment comes. Let anyone compare the poem John Cornford wrote not long before he was killed, before the storming of Huesca, with Sir Henry Newbolt's "There's a breathless hush in the close tonight." Put aside the technical differences, which are merely a matter of period, and it will be seen that the emotional content of the two poems is almost exactly the same. The young communist who died heroically in the International Brigade was public school to the core. He had changed his allegiance, but not his emotions. What does that prove? Merely the possibility of building a socialist on the bones of a blimp, the power of one kind of loyalty to transmute itself into another, the spiritual need for patriotism, and the military virtues, for which, however little the boiled rabbits of the left may like them, no substitute has yet been found.